Welcome to CSC220. This is Introduction to Cybersecurity. Today is Wednesday, the 18th of October, 2023. What you see before you is just an example of two module assessment results. The first one here, the first series, is the first attempt, and the second series is the second attempt. These are student scores that were extracted anonymously from another class. The column in the middle is the credit that's posted for reconciliation. Okay. And what I wanted to do was to explain in brief what happens after a final attempt of a module assessment is posted. What I'll do is find the lowest score and then put a 0 there with a comment that says, oh, your final attempt was a higher score, you're better prepared for the cumulative final. Good work, or something like that. But I'll manually post a 0 here because the first attempt of the module assessment was lower than the score on the second. And you notice, because the individual had not completed a reconciliation, what's happened is that the second attempt score is higher, yes, but not maximum, right? And then here you see where students have reconciled. So I'd post a 0 here, and I'd post a 0 here, and I'd have the same basic comments, right? So what I wanted to do was to explain in the My Grades portion of your Blackboard screen for this course, you're going to notice that there were some manual entries where the low score was zeroed out. In some cases, the low score is with the retake, or it's a similar score. It's identical or similar to the original attempt. And in each case, I zero out the lower of the two scores, whether it's the final attempt or it's the initial attempt, and I post a comment. And I wanted to explain that because every year when I start doing this, basically I get students who email me or call me and say, hey, you're taking credit out of my total score. And that's because you get to keep the higher score. The lower score is zeroed out. Are there any questions about what we're doing with our retakes?
No,
The other
no
thing, yeah,
question.
okay. The other thing that we started doing is we posted a condition for the retake so that you have to at least submit, you have to upload at least one submission for the reconciliation in order for the retake to be accessible. Can everyone see the due date here? This Saturday, 21 October?
Yeah.
So by the end of this week, what we want you to do is to complete the retake of the Module 2 assessment. So it's the final version of the assessment. There were corrections posted based on our review. And if you would like to do that before Saturday, 11:59 p.m. this Saturday is passed, you need to post something in reconciliation. Now, if you get everything correct, that means you'd have a 5.5 score for your assessment. Now, I get people all the time that say, oh, I didn't get any mistakes. I got a flawless score. And then I look and it's like, well, you got a 5, but there was extra credit. So you got something wrong. If you scored less than a 5.5, that means you made a mistake with the extra credit or elsewhere. And the fact that you got 5 out of 5 or 5.25 out of 5, you still made a mistake, right? So correct the mistake. It's trivial. It takes It takes 60 seconds, post it. You'll receive a full point for the correction attempt, and then you get to retake the assessment, okay? Does everybody understand that final attempts of the module assessment now require the reconciliation?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to start with module 3 now, incidents and cyber ethics. So now we get into incident handling and contingencies and the law. And one thing I'd like to do is take a moment to walk through each of the assignments and the solution. So this is where we start getting into the hands-on part, and we leave most of the theory and concepts behind, and we start getting our hands dirty. And here's a practical assignment that had to do with the exploit of a campus system. So South Carolina State University is a minority serving institution. It's an HBCU, as is the University of the Virgin Islands. And what you need to do is take a quick look at the assignment instructions, right? So there's a brief explanation, and then you're asked to watch specific YouTube videos. And then we want you to reflect on each of those 3 YouTube videos. The goal is for you to think about the attack scenarios. So when the exploit is playing out in each of these 3 cases, what are the common elements for each scenario? Okay. So that's part 1. We want you to provide an answer to that question after you watch the 3 videos. Part 2, you want to read both articles about South Carolina State University. There's article number 1 and article number 2. And then we ask the question, how is this ransomware attack related to the ID theft scenarios shown in part 1? And there is a common link, and it's not so obvious, but it centers on the word identity. So what we're saying is that when it comes to exploits, there's a component that usually hinges on identity. Your identity, an identity that's been stolen, or, a false identity, right? You'd call that impersonation. The simple truth is we want you to take a look at some scenarios. And this is where cybersecurity starts to get interesting. And I want to tell you that this is where it also gets difficult. It's easy to read concepts and then explore methods and do the tech stuff, right? But what's true is that we're really dealing with scenarios. When you talk about cybersecurity, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are people involved. There's an environment, a surrounding environment. There are technology resources, hardware, software, network connectivity. There's all sorts of extra elements in that picture, and those make all the difference. And that's what makes cybersecurity a challenge specifically, because there are many different facets to a scenario, especially when we're talking about an incident. Now, an incident is not necessarily a situation that triggers law, right? So a cyber incident is an event that has a specific signature. So you can have any particular system event. What do I mean? If I go to my File Explorer, and then I manage my system. If I go to the management console, on your screen, it would say My Computer. And what I'd like you to do is to kind of follow along. So for those of you that have laptop screens, what you should do is open up your File Explorer and then go to where it says My Computer or This Computer, unless you've named it. Right-click it and then go to, and by the way, all I did was take where it says My Computer or This Computer, and I renamed it, right? So at some point, that's why you see the computer name Zorg there. If I have 10 different screens open, when I look at the system icon, I want to know which system I'm working with, not just this computer, this computer, this computer, this computer, my computer, my computer, my computer. In any case, are there any questions about how to access the computer management console? Would someone unmute your microphone and respond to the question, have you seen this resource in this class before?
Yes.
I have showed you this resource. Okay. So this utility screen is a template, and you'll see things for DHCP management, DNS management, computer management, services, and so on. This framework here, you select the main topics here, and then it populates all the detail there. What I'm most interested in is Event Viewer, right? So when I look at the Windows logs in Event Viewer, I can look at the system events. And so when we're talking about incidents, that's a specific word we want to distinguish from the word event. So an event is any particular loggable entry that's of interest for the system's logs. So we have application logs, we have setup logs, security logs, and system logs. And here you see a warning, right? So it says the system failed to register a record for a specific DNS server, right? So I've been noodling with DNS in another class, and I'm doing that for network forensics, and I changed some settings, and now it's generating an event on my system. Now, as long as the event is automatically generated and it's to be expected, or it's known and it's a customary kind of thing, the routine, right? So it's generated because when you reboot a system after you have updates, you have service changes, and so on. Those are system events. But when it reflects something of interest, where there's an audit failure or an access failure or a login failure, if there are login attempts that repeatedly fail, that's no longer a set of events. As a pattern, we would call that an incident. If we have multiple login attempts that fail, let's say that again. We have a series of failed logon events. Together, the pattern is considered to be an incident. So when you use the word incident, you're saying, okay, there's a cybersecurity component here, potentially, right? There's a potential cybersecurity interest. How does that sound so far?
That sounds good.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, pretty logical, right? Now, let's say that we have an incident and we know there's a cybersecurity component. One of the things that we want to call out in this module are the distinctions between what's legal and what's ethical. Now, this causes a lot of issues for cybersecurity professionals if they don't understand the basics about how to parse out what has to do with law that's required versus what's right or wrong. There are cases where things can be just plain wrong, but it's not against the law. And everybody has a common life experience. You know what I'm talking about. It may not break a law, but the ethical part of it is it's not right. And in cybersecurity, what I want you to understand is that context is everything. If there's something weird going on in the workplace, it may be bad for the business. And there could be an incident where there's a cybersecurity component and it's wrong. What's happening is wrong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a law is broken. Now, do any of you believe that the reverse is also possible? Could we have the flip side of that?
The flip side being the ethics are right, but the law is wrong.
Correct.
I think you could.
Right. You could have something that's ethical, but it technically breaks the law, right? It's probably easier to say that what's lawful and unlawful is a smaller subset of ethics. Usually, if it's ethical, in most cases, there's a law, but not always. There are rare cases, though, where you have a law about a thing and the ethics is outside that limit. So you can have a case where you need to do something that's ethically correct, but depending on the jurisdiction, and jurisdiction has to do with the law. So laws have to do with formal requirements that are passed by legislators. You know this, right? Legislators write laws, and then the laws are passed, and then law enforcement, our executive branch, enforces the laws. And the executive branch by itself can come up with regulations. So we have legislative law where the government passes a bill. So they have a bill and they propose a thing and then everybody votes on it. And now it no longer ceases to be a bill. It's now a law. I'm kind of curious, but have most of you had some kind of US government course or civics course or something like that? US history? Anything like that?
I mean, in high school, yeah.
In high
Yeah.
school. Yeah, in high school. Right. So you learned about how legislatures they propose bills and they debate and they turn the bill into a law. And if it passes one house or both houses, depending on the government, sometimes there's only a Senate, other times there's a House of Representatives and a Senate. If it passes that and the chief executive of the government, in this case the president, signs the law after it's been passed in Congress, then it becomes a law, right? But the president or the governor of the Virgin Islands, DPNR could have a regulation. And if DPNR, under the authority of the governor of the Virgin Islands, has a requirement that has to do with water quality or air or the health of the air we breathe, right? Those things are called regulatory laws, right? And then on top of that, the courts, when people go to court and there are court cases, civil court cases and criminal court cases, when a judge rules, that's called case law. So when a judge makes a decision, that decision sets a precedent. It's called a precedent. So if we have a case where two people are sitting there with their smartphones and one of them turns on the audio recording app and they record their friend's remarks, and then they play it back for their boyfriend. And then there's a falling out and they break up. And the one friend sues the other, right? And then there's a court case, and the judge says, hey, you can't use your smartphone to record somebody if they're not aware of it. That's a privacy violation. That case becomes case law or precedent because in future court cases, when people are recording with their smartphone, since a judge has already made a decision, there's a strong trait in our judicial system where we have courts and review with lawyers, and people are arguing with plaintiff and defendant. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a lawsuit for money or if it's criminal. Once a decision is made, that decision can become law. And those are the three sources of law, right? So you have legislatures, you have executives, and agency heads that have regulations, and then you have judges that make decisions, and that's case law. And those are binding. Law is binding, meaning it's required. If you live in that area, if you live under that jurisdiction, it applies to you. The problem with law is that there's a lot of overlap. So we have a territorial form of government, but then is our territory the only government we need to be concerned with in the U.S. Virgin Islands?
No, it's not.
It's not. What other government do we need to worry about?
The US of A.
The U.S. of A., the federal government. Yes, yes, thank you. So it's the U.S. federal government that also applies. And what happens if one level or jurisdiction of law is stricter than the other? Which one is the one you follow? Which one's the safe one to follow?
The federal one?
Well, let's say that the local one is stricter than the federal one. Would it be
So
okay to ignore the local one because the federal one's less strict?
no.
No, because then the local law enforcement could get on you about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what about the other way? Let's say that we have a local territorial law that's not as strict as a US federal law. Which one do we pay attention to?
I mean, since you live there, the local law would be like your first thing to pay
Correct.
attention to?
Correct. But then if the federal US law in the mainland is stricter, would you also have to worry about that one?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. And the stricter law would overrule the more lenient mandate, right? So if you had something that wasn't as strict, the stricter, regardless of level, that's what I want you to understand. You're going to have jurisdictions that overlap because in the states, in the U.S. mainland, you have municipal or city governments, right? So you have city ordinances, then you have state laws, then you have federal laws, and some are stricter than others at different levels. Which one are you supposed to pay attention to? The stricter one. The other thing to remember too is that when it comes to cyber, if you get on a network, you could be crossing international boundaries very fast. So the other part about jurisdiction and the law that's really hard to understand, and this isn't always in your textbook, right? This stuff isn't always in the textbook as plainly. The jurisdiction, right, with cybersecurity can quickly become international law, or it crosses international boundaries, and that triggers other law enforcement. Law enforcement like Interpol, law enforcement like the United Nations, right? So, so has anybody ever heard of Interpol?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
In like
Well,
movies.
Yeah, in the movies, you've heard about it, right? So international police, right? International Criminal Police Organization in Lyon, France. It enables the police in 194 member countries to work together to fight international crime, right? That's that's pretty amazing. What we're saying is that well, so let's talk about distance. If you're standing in the right place on the edge of St. John, is it possible you could pick up a cellular signal from the British Virgin Islands? Could you pick up cell service from other islands if you were close enough?
I would think so.
That's absolutely correct, right? So if you use your phone in the British Virgin Islands and you do something that's illegal for Great Britain, but it's okay for the US, are you off the hook because you're using a US territory phone with
No.
that's based out? No, you're not, right? Yeah, absolutely. So the jurisdiction issue is something we want to call out. We also want to call out this difference between legalities and law versus ethics, right? In general, if you operate ethically, you most often operate legally. Meaning, if it's ethical, there's usually some kind of law associated with it. If you operate legally, far more often you're operating ethically. One can say that if you're breaking the law, you're not ethical. Okay. But you could break a code of ethics and not break the law technically. So, in general, it may be easier to understand that requirements under law is a smaller footprint than requirements according to ethical standards, right? I don't know if I'm making sense, but in any case, this is something that takes a little bit of time to get your head around. And one of the things that I want to call out to you is that when you have events and they become a cybersecurity incident, it may be local and there's no law involved and there's no ethical issue, but it still has to be taken to task because it's a cybersecurity incident. Whenever you break ethical boundaries, there's usually policies and procedures in the local organization that are triggered. So something that's ethical in the workplace, if you break those ethics, there might be a policy or a procedure that is formally defined, right, by the business or by the company or by the government agency, but not necessarily a law. And that's where it really helps to understand how all of this is framed or structured. How does an individual and an organization, right? How do we resolve legal and ethical contradictions? One of our goals for this course is to help you to think in broader terms about technology because the boundaries are so fluid. You could access a website that's just down island, one hop over on the Caribbean network, but it's international when you do that. And once you cross international boundaries, there are some things that become legal or illegal simply because it's a different country, right? And as soon as you cross those boundaries, as soon as you access those resources in the other country, you may be subject to those laws, right? I want you to understand that there are worst case scenarios that you should prepare to manage with an ethical response. What do we mean by that? Um, when you run into a cybersecurity incident, you want to immediately start thinking in terms of ethics. Okay, is there anything that's right or wrong about this that we need to address? And as long as it's a nuisance issue and it's like, okay, Oh, they crashed my system. Oh, they infected my computer. I'll reload my computer, right? There's a nuisance issue. It's a productivity issue, but not necessarily ethics. Once you get into ethical territory, the next question you want to ask yourself is, okay, if there's an ethical challenge here, does that go even further where we have legal obligations? That's one of the process steps that you want to be able to work through whenever you encounter cybersecurity incidents, right? That's part of what we call a contingency. If there's no ethical element to it, then you just fix the darn thing and you move on. But what if there's an ethical component? You don't break laws, so you don't have to report. You don't have to report to a government agency. You don't have to report to law enforcement. Okay? But there's an ethical issue. Oh, the credit cards were exposed. Would you consider it ethical if a company knew the credit card data for their customers was exposed and the company chose not to notify the customers?
Nope.
That
Then
would
in that case, it could become law because people could sue for that, right?
Yes, in fact, it's not only unethical to withhold disclosure of the compromise, but depending on where you live, it's also against the law. So it's just bad business. It's bad ethics, right? Is it ethical for employers to spy on their employees constantly? I mean, even to the point where they're in their personal business.
Nah.
It's not ethical. And in fact, it may not be illegal, but there have been lawsuits where employers have said, yeah, if you use our network, we get to look at whatever you're doing. And then the lawsuit in court becomes case law. It's not that a bunch of legislators got together and said, hey, nobody can monitor what you're doing on a network. That's a breach of privacy. It may be that there isn't a law that's that plain. But the truth is, you always have to be able to work fluidly depending on the situation. And you always want to keep an eye out in every incident, every single incident, every last one. The first question you want to ask is, are there ethical or legal components to this situation? And if there are, how does my handling of the scenario change? That's what we mean by contingency. Contingency is plan B, plan C, plan D. Okay, we didn't break a law, but we hurt some of our customers, and it's the right thing to do to let our customers know. We're not bound to do that by law, but if it hurts their business and they find out it's us, that's just bad karma, right? So you have different responses or contingencies based on the legal and ethical context. All right. So from here, what I want to do is kind of walk into some of the key points about this. And in fact, when you look at your assignments, here we just talk about the scenario and the context. And that's going to give us an opportunity to make better sense out of the content in this module. So when we start digging into the study guide, there's also an addendum. You have a study guide, and there are about 12 student learning objectives, right? Formal student learning objectives. And then these are the topics in modules 5 and 6 in the textbook, right? So we're talking about chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6 of the textbook. In the addendum, we're going to talk about ethical standards, right? Conduct. And in fact, one of your assignments for this in this course module, in module 3 of the course, we want you to sign off before we teach you how to hack some things and do some things. We want you to take a quick look at an ethical standard and agree to it. Because if you don't, we're not teaching you about cybersecurity in the best manner. I know this says CSC343, but we'll change that so it says CSC220. In any case, it says, I affirm that I may also exercise the option to use these tools and methods only on my own personal technology devices and systems at my own risk, right? So I'm going to teach you how to use some hacking methods in this course. And you have to agree before I teach you to use all forensic resources in an ethical and legal manner, right? Now, we have the same agreement that we use for digital forensics in our class in digital forensics. We teach some methods here in Intro to Cyber. We teach a great deal more of the forensic methods in CSC 343 digital forensics. So the form that we put out there, I'm gonna revise this form and update it so it reads 220, right? We want you to be able to say, I agree or disagree, and then we file it, right? And it's important for people to establish what's ethical, what's legal. Do I understand it? Do I agree to it before we start digging in with the hands-on stuff? Any questions so far about the second assignment? Your third engagement in this module is a full-blown solution, and there's actually quite a bit of context to it. We're going to examine a situation where some very passionate people working for a nonprofit organization are, well, they're embroiled in a cybersecurity challenge, right? And one of the things that we want you to do is to read the context. So once again, one of the things that we need to spend some time examining. Can everybody see this screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So I spent part of a summer to develop a scenario that would be typical of a nonprofit organization, right? And so if you think about it, in our communities, we have nonprofit organizations, and people are very passionate about this. I used names that could fit either a male or female, right? Or non-binary individual, right? So I chose names so that we wouldn't stereotype either males or females, okay? So I spent a lot of quality time trying to work on this. But anyway, Sydney Corinth is a professional conservation advocate who began to work at the Association for Endangered Species, right? APHES. That's what the acronym stands for. Association for Endangered Species. It's an international nonprofit organization, or NPO. And because they're international, they have to do what? Abide by certain ethical and legal standards, international ones. Now, APHES also receives US federal funding. So as soon as that trigger hits, if you receive federal grants or federal funding to conduct and study and perform related conservation activities intended to promote the survival of all endangered species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, that's a law, right? That's a legislative program, right? If you receive that federal money, now you have to abide by federal standards for data and that kind of thing, okay? So what we have here is a case where you have to read some short stories and you have to learn about Sydney. You have to learn about what happens, right? So Sydney goes away on a conference in Rio de Janeiro. And Sydney was embroiled in an office romance with a vice president, right? And Sydney has a thing for penguins. Sydney wants to save the endangered penguins, right? And there are other stakeholders at APHIS that are basically more into things like snow leopards and red pandas and, you know, the exotic animals, and they get a lot of attention for that reason, right? They want to save the pandas, and that's, I guess, in some circles, that's more important than penguins. I don't know. Anyway, there's office politics, right? You have some office politics in the mix. What we want you to do is to spend the time to read this so that you understand the context. And we want you to distinguish between the role of a digital evidence first responder and that of a digital evidence specialist. So if you're an incident handler, you are the first responder. You're like the rescue, the ambulance, the EMT and paramedics, or fire or police. Your first responders. Typically, digital evidence first responders are technical people, information technology professionals who have had some training in incident handling, incident response. A digital evidence specialist is somebody that is highly trained to examine digital evidence, data, right? So a digital evidence specialist, or DES, is a professional, and that's the generic term for it, for a forensic investigator, right? So this is the person that does the deep analysis. Does everybody understand the difference between DEFR and DES?
Yeah.
Now, the first responder's job is to preserve evidence if there is some, and get the organization working again. The DES, the forensic person, their responsibility goes much further in terms of the analysis of that data, right? So quite often, the people most often or most commonly involved with the first round of activity in any cybersecurity scenario aren't the forensic people. It's the incident handlers. And so what we're going to do on Friday is examine that in greater detail, and we're going to walk you through how it is you complete the steps of your incident response solution. So you're going to put yourself in the shoes of an incident responder on behalf of the nonprofit organization known as APHIS. And that's what we'll cover on Friday. Please be sure that you take your final attempt of the Module 2 assessment soon. And if you would, get started here with the first two assignments and begin your review of the study guides and study guide addendum. Because we're dealing with legal and ethical, we also have to examine things like how to preserve the evidence, how can you search for and seize digital evidence, right? So these are additional references that we're going to be taking the time to investigate. That's pretty much it for today. Does anyone have any questions about Module 3 and the main topics that we'll be engaging in Module 3?
Not for me, but yeah, I'm excited. Sounds like a fun module.
Say again?
So I don't really have any question. I was just saying that it sounds like a fun module.
Yes, it is. I think this is where our class starts to get really interesting. From this point forward, it's more hands-on, and you start doing more with the tools and the methods. And I think this is where people get it. It's easier because it's more interesting, right? And it keeps you out of jail. And wouldn't it be a good goal for this course for you to learn about cybersecurity enough so you'd know when and how to do what's lawful and avoid what is unlawful with cybersecurity tools? Yeah. We don't want to read about you in the blotter. Now, today in St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, a former student of the University of the Virgin Islands applied cybersecurity methods in a housing association and hacked the local network. Law enforcement officers confiscated, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, 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 that's not why we teach you this stuff. But this is where it gets the most interesting. So, anyone ever seen the movie Spider-Man? Uncle
Yeah.
Ben?
Yeah.
Yeah. With great power comes great responsibility, something like that. Yeah. All right, we'll close for now. We'll see you Friday. Thanks for joining us.